All right, so here we are in 3D Coat. Just opened it up, and the first thing we want to do when we're going to go painting is I'm going to select this Paint UV Mapped Mesh per Pixel option right here with the 3 colors. I'm going to click that, and then I'm going to click the folder, and then go ahead and select our model, open it up. You're going to see this dialog box. Pretty much I don't touch any of these. You could look through them, see if there's anything that interests you. Like there's stuff where you could toss out the UVs that are already there if you want to do that for some reason. I'm just going to name the UV set name, call it dummy. You don't really have to do that. If you're working with multiple UVs, it's useful to do that. So that'll set what your UVs are called when you go to the editor. If you go to the editor, we probably won't be doing that in this case. And then you could set the resolution that your texture is going to be. In this case, 2480 is a bit high for what we need. I'm going to put it at 1024, and we'll likely downsize it to a 512 later just to get it more game ready, if you will. But 1024 generally these days is no sweat for most games. Hit OK. Boom. So there is our model. We could check out the UVs on the side here in your texture editor view. If yours doesn't have it open, I believe you go to textures, and then the texture UV editor will pop that open. You could also paint directly in here, which is cool. Sometimes that's useful. A lot of times I will just jump into Photoshop. 3D Coat lets you, if you're new to the program, lets you kind of seamlessly go back and forth between the programs, which is quite nice. So we'll be doing that a lot too. I have my paint objects here on the side. It's just a little tear off that I pulled out from the Windows pop-ups. You get your paint objects, and I move it over so I just always have, here it is, access to it. So I could turn things on and off, different elements of the model, make it easy to just hide things for a while. If you hold Alt and click, it hides multiple. Alt and click again, it'll unhide all. So it's a nice, easy way to kind of solo things. I got my color palette up. I just like having this available. And then I set a couple presets. So again, in Windows, you could basically take brushes that you use pretty often and right click in here and then just do add preset, and that'll go ahead and make a new setting for you. So it's kind of useful. I just made these really briefly beforehand, just pretty much hard and soft brushes. That way I don't have to dig into the alphas. But otherwise, let's start setting this guy up for our texture. And so one of the things I like to do first when I'm working in 3D Coat and in this style is there's a lot of like modern things that could save you some time. So the first couple things we're going to do, I'm going to go into the textures up here, and then I'm going to go down and I'm going to, click calculate occlusion. That's the first thing I'm going to do. And it's basically going to fake global illumination by putting a bunch of lights everywhere in the order you wish, and then baking it down into a texture. So I like to do sphere plus hemisphere. That way you get all around lighting, but a little more on the top. And then whether or not you click separate paint objects will determine whether or not they're going to interact with one another. So you could turn that on and off, and like you might see like shadows from the belt being cast on the body normally. And if you check this, it'll only basically cause AO on the model, the element of itself. So in this case, I'm going to have them work together. Since we have overlapping UVs, there's going to be some cases where we have trouble. So like right here on the sword, the front and back, we're getting AO. So it wasn't quite sure what to do there. And then also you notice on the hand and shield, because the shield was mirrored this way, we're getting that shadow that was cast here on the other side, as well as I'm sure you noticed from the ropes on that arm, because the UVs, again, were mirrored. So this is something we could paint out. Because they're mirrored means we can't have specific shadows there. We could probably put like a general darkening there, because it's pretty much exactly where the shield is, where the ropes are. So we could kind of fake some general shadow there. It's a trade-off, right? You get more out of your texture, but you can't do unique things in that way if you wanted them both to have individual unique textures. So that's something to be aware of with that. So that's one. Immediately you can see how far that got us. If I turn it into unlit mode by pressing 2, this is now just texture, no lighting at all from 3D Coat. So you can see me toggling it on and off. it pretty much defines the planes really well already of the model. So that saves us a lot of time right away. And the next thing we can do is I like to do the light baking tool. You could do calculate curvature if we use normal maps. So in the future, that could be useful. We might be doing that in Marmoset in that case, but if you're loading a normal map on there, curvature could be useful. I'll show you what it does real quick. If you're curious, it basically outlines all the spots that are either deep in or coming out. So if I turn this on, so I get our crevices and our protrusions. So in this case, it's just kind of outlining everything. I don't really like that look. It can be useful if you turn it down, right, and just kind of pops the edges slightly. But we'll be doing that kind of manually, so I'm just going to ditch that. And then do light baking tool. So this is kind of similar to the AO, but it's just going to be a light. Same thing, I'll do sphere, hemisphere into a new layer. And I just leave the rest of it pretty much the same. Now this darkened it a lot. And the layer is set to multiply. So you can either turn it down, which at that point you might not even notice what it's doing, just kind of darkening things. I like to put it on either overlay or soft light, I believe it was, to get a little more out of it. So like maybe we'll crank it up just so you can see the difference at kind of full volume here. So off and on. The thing to notice here is the soft shadows going down on like the stomach and on the shoulder pads and the head. See how we're getting the light to shadow? So it's kind of solving some of the form for us already from the get-go, which is going to save time. We're going to paint over it, but this is going to give us that form that normally we would have to go and paint in manually each time. And, you're always going to want to double check it even after we paint over this. But this is just using the technology to give us a little head start. So obviously it's not flawless. We still have these to kind of fix, and we could either do that later or we could do it now. I kind of like doing it at the beginning, even though you're just going to be painting over it anyway. So, it's whatever your preference is. But I'll show you how I'm going to fix it right now, just for the sake of it. So I'll go in, change the layer blending mode to standard, and now we're going to see the map as it is. And I'm just going to go in, and I'm just going to grab the color. V is color picker here in 3D Coat, and I'm just going to paint it out. It doesn't have to be perfect, but enough that we don't see the weirdness. Also in 3D Coat, holding Shift is kind of smooth, which is really nice. I kind of wish Photoshop had that, to be honest. So it did the front and the back. Then we have this on the sword. Paint over that. So it doesn't look too weird. Smooth it out. And then what else was there? We also had the back of the shield and the arm. So we'll just do that really quick. And then we should be good, I think, for continuing. And obviously we have to do the direct light map. Does the job. It's a little tedious depending on how much overlap you have. A lot of times you can just flatten this kind of stuff out, but it doesn't take too long. I thought we'd just go through it. So one thing I like turning on while doing this, if I have trouble hitting a certain angle, is this button right here under the word metalness. It looks like a line with like a ring around it. And this lets me kind of aim the camera whichever direction I want and rotate it ways that might not normally be possible, at least in the Maya movement mode, because we were just in Maya, so I'm kind of carrying that forward, which you can set if you want to change your movement mode. The little down arrow by camera, custom navigation, and then you'll see you can do standard default here, Maya, soft image, if any of you have used that, or ZBrush-like. So either Maya or ZBrush-like I tend to stick with, but lately it's been Maya. And of course, that's pure preference. Okay. So not perfect, but it gets rid of what we need to get rid of, which was the distractingly dark lines. Good there. And then there's going to be some shadows like behind the grass here. I'm going to leave it because it might come in handy. And then the direct light map. I'm going to put this back to multiply. And then I'm going to do this one and set that to standard as well. And kind of the same thing. I'll go through it pretty quick. So one thing you can do if you don't want to wait through this is use the fill tool, which is in this button up here. You could go all the way to the end. It's like this triangle, and it fills in a polygon at a time. So I could just click, and we're not going to get that soft shading, but it's not really a big piece, so it might not be important to us to keep it exactly, right? So like maybe flattening out, in this case, save us a little time, and we could focus on getting to the actual texture. I'll just go ahead and just kind of get a middle ground color. There we go. And that way we didn't have to paint it. And we could add the shadows again later. Now, shield. Shield is pretty easy. Make sure I change back to my regular brush. And then lastly, the arms. Now, I would encourage you to get creative with how you unwrap stuff too, because there's cases, depending on how much texture space you're allotted, like if you can get away with a 512 or a 256, or if you have to use smaller, you can get creative with how you place things. Like for example, this arm, we could have technically did the front and the back mirrored, right? And that would save a lot of space, and we'd only have to paint one half of it. The trade-off, of course, is that the back would look like the front. But if that doesn't bother you, if that it works in a scenario, or wherever you're painting it, it won't matter. Then it's a neat little trick. Kind of save some time and some texture. So there we go. Now let's save this before we forget, because that's important too. So I'm going to go ahead, do combat dummy. Yeah, we'll keep it consistent. Dummy 1. There we go. Actually, I think 3D Coat, when it iterates, it does 3 digits. So it would do 001. So if I did the save incrementally, it would do 01 space 001. So I'm going to change this really quick. Just going to add one more O to have it play nice. There you go. All right, now I'm going to set this back to overlay. We get the difference in the lights there. And now I'm going to go into layer 01 here, and I'm going to rename it actually first. I'm going to name it base color. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to kind of put in what I want the colors, like the general color to be. So like, for example, the wood I want to be that brown, the metal I want to be that, kind of orangey gray, etc. So I'm going to go in, I'm going to choose the fill tool, which is this little bucket, the paint bucket. Grab my color palette here, and we're just going to start picking colors that fit what we need and then dropping them in here so we could see them. So this is kind of like our underpainting. Let's go in and we'll start. This doesn't have to be the final colors, but I do recommend trying to get them close so you can edit a little less later. This is also really dark on top of it right now, so I might lighten it up a little by dropping the opacity on these layers. As long as you could still see that information, you're good, and it's up to you how much you want to show through. But we will be painting on top of this as needed. You already see the color differences because of the light map stuff. That's okay. So we're going through and we're just clicking. Let's get some gray for the rocks. Be a little grayer. All right. Some green for the grass. The grass we're going to paint over. So I'll put in a little green right now. Eventually I'm going to fill it with black and we're just going to do like an alpha thing, or we might paint that outside of 3D code. We'll see. We'll get there when we get there. All right, the posts. And I know the concept wasn't like 100% tied down to the colors yet, because I wanted to see how it looked in here. So we'll probably run around with these for a bit. There we go. Now, a little brighter. Now his body, it was kind of similar, his body to the wood. I remember that, so be careful. Make sure they look distinct enough. His will go a little more yellow, a little more saturated. Body could probably be a little more desaturated. We just need to make sure we separate those two. So we'll get to that too. Okay, the metal. So we already filled in the shield, but we need to get the metal parts of the shield. And so one trick we can do here for filling this easily, instead of having to paint it manually, we'll use that triangle tool again, the polygonal tool, when your brush is selected, and then again you just fill in the polygon at a time. So this is really nice. You go in and just get that color filled in. And then for the bolts, we can switch back the paint bucket tool. The space bar brings this menu up, by the way. There we go. Fill those. Rope. And then we can do the same for the inside here. Those are just kind of colorful, actually. or maybe metallicize them a little later. So be careful with the fill tool, and if you're at an extreme angle and you click it, you see it kind of fades. It didn't do the full thing. It has like a gradient because it's like based on your camera. So go over it, make sure you're facing the polygon as much as you can when you use this. It generally is not a problem, but if you notice that fade, that's why. Okay. So let's get the back of this. Belt. A lot of similar brown tones, so we'll have to work around that to make sure it doesn't all feel the same. I mean, it's good in that it harmonizes the guy, but once we start painting the texture on there, like this will obviously look more like wood, etc. But that's the first thing I'm like noticing right away. Boop. Boop. Okay, that's enough fun. Stop it. Boop. No. All right, we gotta get the metal up here, and then we'll bring this green up top. So back with the shield, we are gonna have to do something a little different for the back of it because the polygon is huge, right? It's not going to let us do that same trick because it's based on the polygons themselves. So we're going to have to actually go in and paint those. So however we envision the back of it to look, which we did a little sketch of, so I remember that. So we can go in with basically a hard brush. So I'm going to grab this right here, the constant pressure, and just draw where I want that area to be. Again, we'll be painting all of this over later, but this is just it's good to have like a solid start to work with. Also, if you hold control while you're drawing, it erases, but unfortunately it erases everything there. So if this was on a different layer, you'd be able to remove it, but it's handy going forward. There we go. There's the back of that. And what's left? Obviously, things staring right at us, the tabard. Fill that in. It's a little dark, but we could assume that we need to fill these. And it's also another reason that we shouldn't have this on as hard. I'm gonna tone that down a little. Oops. Wrong layer. Tone this down just a little. I mean, we're not going to really see that, so it's not a huge concern, but still. And again, by control clicking it, you get to solo it. I'm just going to make sure that I didn't actually paint on that layer. Helm. Now we're good. I can look at the base color layer by itself. Say, okay, we missed right there. And then this faded a little. Cool. So now what's left is these little things inside. Pop, pop. And then the tabard, which we will do similar to the shield. I'm going to grab a red. Paint it. There we go. I kind of like the orange a little. Not going to lie. Not as bold as the concept, but it's pretty good. I mean, this is all subject to change as we paint along anyway. So in this case, again, you could have created another layer, which I'll do here, and then we'll just see. I'll name it tabard outline. Now we could go. Make sure you save, of course. And then, ooh, we see all the shadows there. Thankfully, everything's on top of that. But we might want to kind of dim it down too. It looks like both the direct light map and the AO came in there pretty heavy. So I'm actually going to go through the AO, choose a white brush. Actually, maybe I could do the paint bucket. And just lower my opacity a little to dim it. There we go. Might do a higher color so we don't hit the base color as hard. Actually, we keep it white. There we go. Since we're lowering the opacity, it'll do the job. There we go. Put that like 60%, oops, 40%. Easy enough, not too bad. So let's bring in the light map again. See, it's still super dark, so. Just gonna use the eraser now. And this stuff isn't completely necessary, I just didn't want it to get too dark. Again, we'll paint over it, but it's hard to get rid of like super dark stuff sometimes. There we go. We'll go into the tabard outline. We'll grab that color. In this case, it's like a dark gray, I believe. Let's see. It's just like a gray. I'll pick like a little green gray. Go back to my regular brush. That's the one. And we'll fill that in. Same kind of thing. We'll go in. We'll just paint the edges. Now, one thing that's kind of cool is this thing up here called Steady Stroke. If you've ever used like Lazy Nezumi or any kind of lazy brush in ZBrush, it's that, but in 3D Coat. So if you want to do like really kind of crisp strokes, that way if your hand's wiggling, it still comes out nice. That's really handy. You can see it lagging behind the dot there. So maybe you'll have fun using that, but that's good to know if it's there. The shortcut is Alt-S, I believe, and then you could just change the amount by dragging up here. So I don't use it too often, but I really like the option. I like having it there because it does come in handy every now and then. And then on the back here, now remember what I said about control. So you could paint higher and then hold control and give yourself a nice sharp point by erasing with the same brush. Be really handy rather than switching constantly to the eraser tool. Something about using the same brush to erase can be useful, especially if you're using like a splatter brush or some kind of grunge that we could erase away and get different grunge patterns. It's pretty nifty. I suppose we should also do the inside. Even if people aren't going to see it much, we need to take care of that. And then we'll also paint the entire trim there, or the inside. Also, just like in ZBrush, holding shift while moving the camera will snap it to an orthographic view, like the front or the side. And then if you press numpad 5, it'll actually make it an orthographic camera. I think, yeah, 4, 5, 6, the whole numpad actually switches the camera around to orthographic. But pressing 5 toggles it from perspective to orthographic if you need an exact side view or whatnot, or exact front view, which can be very handy in a lot of cases, especially if you're putting down something like stamps. Okay. So, getting a little, splitting hairs a little on some of the stuff. So let me back up. There we go. So now we have the trim line along him. We got all our other basic colors in there. We still need to block in the face, but we'll get there. We'll start blocking in, sketching in details where we want them, and then we'll paint on top of that. I think there is one more line I need to make though in this guy, in here. Another handy tip is pressing F will set the focus point for what you rotate around. So you can tap F and then say, I want to rotate around here. You get a little more control over your camera. But I tend to fixate on stuff I gotta stop. Like if I see something that's like just out of the right shape, I'm just like, I want it to just be a little sharper, and like obsessed. It's like, oh no, stop it, pull back. All right, good, we're good, everything's fine. But yeah. So we'll keep going with this guy. But now we have all the colors blocked out. It lets us kind of visualize the color scheme too, which you could change pretty easily now just by using, for instance, the magic wand tool. So if we want to use the magic wand tool and click a color, well, in this case, let me click up here, use albedo tolerance, use color / albedo tolerance up there. And so there it will go, and it'll select all that color. So if you wanted, you could theoretically click one of those, and it's changing because of the light map. So if I turn those off, I believe, there we go. So I can select those two things, and now go, first let me hide for frozen here. So Control F hides the frozen, and then I can go ahead and adjust hue, saturation, lightness. If I turn preview on, I should be able to edit this. Of course, it's frozen right now. I need to invert it. That's my bad. So let's see. Freeze. Invert. Now, so it's just a similar thing to like Photoshop, but you could do it right in here. Also, this is really gray, but hopefully you can see it now. So you have an option there to change the colors after the fact. You could do it in Photoshop as well. There's plenty of options. Yeah, there is our texture base. So we'll save. Let's try the increment. Yeah, 02, and we'll go from here. All right. So now that we have a basic lock-in for our textures here, we got a good head start thanks to all the tools available at our disposal. What we can do from here, now that we're finally deep in the texturing process, is we're going to want to go through various stages. So I like to kind of go from A, B, C, and you can really do this any way you want. And as you texture more, you kind of get a feeling of, how to get certain results and what, maybe you want to render one part first or do colors or undercolor or draw on top of it. There's all kinds of different ways to tackle this process. And it's going to be fluid. Sometimes you'll notice certain things, so you'll want to do that right away, and then your mind will jump somewhere else, and you'll say, okay, maybe I'll do that now. But I like to follow somewhat of a basic procedure that helps me basically kind of do things in steps, so I'll remember it easier. And to break it down, so like if I was to say what my process was in terms of like A, B, C while I'm texturing, you've already seen the first part. I like to get all the colors blocked in. I like to get a basic lighting kind of baked in, if possible, from the editor that we're using. In this case, we're using 3D Coat, and it helped us to put in all this stuff. So where from here? So next I would like to do basically big shapes of light. So going in and just saying, okay, maybe it's lit more here. This is rounded, so I'm going to light the front of him. We're going to do that in a second. So we're gonna basically block in just generic form on top of the model that we have, so it'll read the way we want it to. So the shapes feel voluminous, so they feel like they're turning properly to our eyes and catching the light properly. After that, I'll usually go and I'll draw in basic surface details. So in this case, it would be like the lines in the shield to break up the planks, maybe some folds or patterns on his, in this case, his face and his tabard, whatever's going to happen with his shirt and pole that he's using as a stand, right? That's wood, so we draw in those wood lines, that kind of thing. So we visualize more, okay, what are these surfaces? Because right now they're all just flat color, not a lot of information in them. So that would be the second step. After that, I'd likely go back in and reinforce those shapes with another pass of like overlay or soft light, and basically just kind of airbrush the form onto it more. After that, I'll go in, add some interest, maybe some hue variations, so it's not all the same red, pepper in some colors that are similar to give it some vibrance. This is also going to be heavily dependent on the style you're going for. For some games, or projects that you're doing, this might be the final result. You might just want it to be kind of flat color with some shading, and there's nothing wrong with that, as long as you know what you have in mind that you want to aim for, and then you can kind of break down visually, okay, how do I get to that point? And so for a lot of the painting I like to do, I like to introduce some color variation, or in the shadows, maybe the shadows are colorized. So I'm looking for stuff like that. After that, we'd go in and polish it up. I'd throw a new layer on top, and I'll just color pick and I'll paint right on there just to get any extra detail, to define the surface more, or if there's scratches, cuts, dings, anything that will just liven up the surface a little more, I'll add there. And then finally, after all that, I'll usually bring it into Photoshop and do some post-processing, such as, in this case, using like curves or levels to get the value structure the way I want. Color balance to maybe some of the colors are feeling a little weird, so I could unify them a little more by using a color balance. And so we'll go through all that, but that's pretty much the step-by-step of how I like to think about it. And now as we're working on it, there might be things that come up that we realize like, oh yeah, I want to do that. Some things might go a little out of order, but I generally go back to those kind of steps to remind myself, okay, I don't want to forget anything. So, I'll read back through those things to myself and say, okay, what am I doing right now? Okay, let me focus just on that. But again, it's fluid. If you want to just go one layer, paint the whole thing, more power to you. That's really fun. I've done that before too. Again, it's going to depend on your goals, but I find this method helps me focus and be able to hit a certain quality consistently. With that being said, let's get started by putting in some big shapes of light. So I'm going to go ahead and do a new layer on top. And I'm going to set this to either overlay or like soft light. We'll do overlay in this case. And I'm going to choose a soft brush. So very feathered. Now, for now, I'm going to leave these layers under here. So they're editable in case we want to edit them. Eventually, I like collapsing them down and just having as few layers as possible. It depends what you still want to be able to control. But for here, I think this will be fine. So I'm just going to call it overlay. Simple enough. So I'll go ahead and pick a color. Remember, with overlay, anything above 50% is going to lighten the colors that are there, and anything under 50% is going to darken it. And 50 will just kind of put it back to the default, I believe, as if it's invisible. Nothing. Turn that off. You still see a little there, so it's still affecting it a little, but not too much. So in this case, I'm just going to go up, do something like 65 or so. And I'm just going to start painting. So I know that I want the light to hit him kind of front on, because that's how we'll be seeing him most of the time. So I'm just going to go in, and I'm going to brush, and I'm thinking about the shapes, right? These are rounded, so I want the light to kind of hit them and bring out that roundedness more. I want to accentuate the shapes that are already there. So what's nice about this is that you could already see the shape because we made it in 3D. So I'm just thinking about if the light is hitting him at this kind of slightly above angle, where's the light going to go? How's it going to act? Right? Like his chest will probably be a little brighter towards the top than towards the bottom. And we could play that up. And so we're essentially kind of sculpting it with the colors and just saying, I want to bring this forward, or I want to push that back. So we'll go ahead and just do this kind of all over him. Now some of these, this is like really dark, but we'll go ahead and paint over that a little later too. I could always change the base color to make it a little brighter, but not that important to me right now. Now feel free to hide and unhide things as needed, or use masking in order to, if you don't want to accidentally like paint over the helm. I'm gonna solo that. And if you're not getting the contrast you want, because I only did very little right here with 60, you could bump it up and then just paint lighter to get those lighter strokes. And then we'll go through and we'll do it darker as well. Oops, sorry. We'll do it darker as well. So if it's not that big of a stretch right here, we'll go in and we'll darken the sides, and that'll make the form rate a little stronger in addition to the light. But you see how it's already making it, even just with soft light, with soft gradients, it's already making it stand out quite a bit more. I might actually try as if the light is coming down from above, lightening the bottom here just slightly so it feels like it's curving outwards like we have it. And with down here, just slightly. Because you want to think about how the mesh is turning in space and how you want it to read. Because if we're going to render this flat color, which we might, then we want to be able to feel the form. Now, a lot of this is dependent on how you want this lit. So you have to think about ahead of time how you want, whatever this fake light is that you're painting in, where is it coming from, and where is it gonna hit the mesh? So even from the back, I'm kind of having it center. Now, if this feels too soft too, you can go in with the standard or hard brush and get a little more kind of angle to it. But sometimes I'll go back in and add the hard edges. So I'll just leave it soft for now. Shield. See how that rounds the shield out almost immediately? Because we know we have it kind of curved, so that means the light is not going to hit it flat. And see, I could be pushing this more, but we're keeping it pretty close value-wise right now, and we could really push that later on. So right now I'm blocking these in just so it reads better. And then, of course, when we do another pass like this later, we'll really pop it. Now, since these are sharing one spot, we're getting kind of brightness on the sides. So we could decide later if we want to split the side ones, like this one and this one, separate from the top and bottom one, just so the values are consistent. For now, we'll just kind of have it in between. That's fine. But it's a good thing to see and to notice. Now 3D Coat, if you hold Control, it'll erase, even with the brush you're using, so you don't have to switch to eraser. That's pretty nice. I'll forget it sometimes, but other times it comes in handy. Whenever you can too, using as big of a brush as possible can be helpful. I forgot what I read it, just in general, like using whatever the biggest brush you can get away with is always usually a good bet. One thing I like to try to remind myself of in terms of like general painting is something called like stroke economy, which is trying to get in as much detail as you can with as few strokes as possible. Now sometimes, this is not going to be the case for certain styles, but even then it's like, okay, what's the minimum amount I can put in to make it read like I want to, so it doesn't look extra busy, right? And so that's something I'm still practicing and getting used to. I have to remind myself every now and then to like, can I just do this with a couple? Because you'll read about like the great masters. Like I'm a big fan of Sargent and how he would just like make every stroke count. And so, I don't know how much of it applies to texturing, but I like to believe that if I can apply those kind of things to this medium as well, then it should, strengthen the result. But it's always going to depend on what you're aiming for. Just something to chew on. Look at that, how that one line just boop added that bevel. That really made it read so much more. So off and on. So it's starting to do some work here. I'll add it to the front too. Okay. Let's do the buckle itself. Make sure you save. If you're following along, make sure you save. It's a good habit. Nothing's worse than working for an hour or even a half hour or more and then having it crash on you or something going wrong with your computer and then you're just sad. I don't want to be sad. So bevels like this aren't really necessary at this point. I just liked how it looked on the other one. So this is one of those cases where I was talking about where it's a little fluid. So you might feel like, okay, I just want to add them in right now because it's not hurting, but it might motivate me more when I look at it. That kind of thing. It's not really showing up too much here. Another thing that's useful is zooming out. You can really see how the light affects the form. If you could paint zoomed out whenever possible, or whenever you remember to, it could give you like a new perspective. It's kind of like flipping the canvas, but in a different way. You just zoom out and your mind reads those colors a little differently, or the values at least. Like that little gap in the center of his chest I didn't see before. You want to bring it up too high because it should be in shadow down there. Remember, shift is smooth in 3D Coat. Kind of wish Photoshop had an option like that where I could just press shift and then smooth it out, like instead of it snapping. Photoshop right now will snap to angles or draw a straight line, wherever the shortcuts are. I like the smooth. Sometimes I'll do as much as possible just in an overlay layer or soft light or whatever, just as much as possible so I don't have to worry about switching colors and stuff like that. It's been pretty handy. Obviously, it's kind of restrictive because you're going to get whatever color's under it, but if the color you need is already there, like in a lot of these cases, then it kind of helps. It's kind of nice. Okay. Almost done with this phase. It didn't take too long, did it? But we're going to do the darks next as well. let's not forget his face. It looks a little too real. We're gonna keep it fake. Having the little split down the middle. And even the color. I might have to change the color. We're hitting that uncanny valley. It's looking so real that yeah, I can't tell. It's just creepy. Oh, the locks here in the paint objects palette will prevent you from painting on that object. So it's quite nice. If you want to make sure that you don't accidentally paint on a adjacent spot or anything nearby. I'm adding little bevels just to see the plane changes. Basically the fake, like there's a bevel there. So one thing to point out with overlay is that you're going to get these kind of hard lines in between because it's just brightening what's underneath. So we will have to paint over that to make sure it doesn't get this weird two-tone bevel. We'd ideally want that color to be the same throughout. But adding this now, it reminds us for one, and then two, we get to visualize it a little better. So that's the reason I'm putting it in right now. Cool. All right, I think I'm gonna brighten this a little more. The getting a little too muddy down there, and brightening it isn't making it compete with the light part. It's just kind of giving it a little more volume overall instead of being so dark. There we go. Okay, do the back of the shield real quick, and then we'll start adding some dark stuff. So we'll do it on another layer, just so I can show you why. It might not be a bad idea sometimes. So one thing to be aware of is I don't particularly love the outliney look where everything has an outline. Like adding the bevels and stuff are nice, but having this on both sides, not really doing it for me. Let's just put it in a couple areas, not the whole thing. That could be something that we get back to and experiment with, because maybe one of these sides is actually dark instead of light. You know, which part is the light hitting more than the other that we want to be highlit. So in this case, yeah, I'll just do that side. And since it's mirrored, we're going to get the light on the top and the bottom. So it'd be a trade-off, either that or we could just kind of fade it away towards the bottom. It's kind of a minor detail, so it's nothing really to worry about, but paying attention to those kind of things. Kind of pulled it out a little by doing that. That's pretty cool. Okay, and you can be sloppier if you want to be kind of like more, I guess, painterly in this part, but just be careful because I like to throw down strokes haphazardly sometimes, and sometimes it could look really nice as long as you wind up, as long as you keep kind of tightening it over time and pulling your shapes closer to where they need to be. Otherwise, like just throwing them around can just kind of look sloppy sometimes too. So be aware of what the actual surface is. Sometimes it could be nice to have that kind of thing. Adds a little texture to the surface. Other times it might just kind of be distracting. So just something to keep in mind. And then with the rocks, like this case, I'm like, oh, I'll just spatter it around a little. But in general, I'm just lighting the top a little more so it has a soft gradient towards the bottom. And these will be painting quite plainer later to make it look like they have, sharp edges and stuff. Stuff like that. We'll come back to it. Now you can see how much, though, all we've really done is add soft gradients to things, but you see how powerful that can be. And it kind of looks nice even just by itself. Okay. So I'm going to save that again. I'm just going to toggle it on and off. That's what we started with. And lightening it up, you can see it's already kind of feels like it has a lot more volume, a lot more form. Now I'm thinking, let's go through and, well, for one, I'm going to lighten this up a little up here, so it's not completely flat. Okay. So I'm going to add another. I'm going to set it to overlay as well. You could do this stuff on the first layer. I'm keeping them separate so that way we can adjust like overall how dark or light. If we wind up painting it too dark, then we could just kind of dial it back a little. Another way to do that would be by going into like levels or curves in Photoshop and then just grabbing the dark values and pulling them up and the light values down, vice versa. That's one way you could just do it on the same layer and still have control over each of those individually. But since we're trying to stay in 3D Coat for now, we can work this way. I set it to overlay, and now I'm going to go darker than 50%, maybe like 35. We'll go 30. So now you see it's painting dark stuff. I'm going to go through it. I'm going to do the same. I'm just going to very lightly brush it in, just to reinforce the shape. Again, nothing crazy, but we're just kind of, we want to have the form be as legible as possible. And so going in and saying, okay, there might be some shadows here, maybe it gets darker towards the bottom more than it has been, that kind of stuff. Around the belt, maybe there's a shadow where the belt is. So we could paint something like that in. Soft gradients. We could add some edge differentiation later between like soft and hard edges. So it's just easier for me personally to focus on just like, okay, let me get all my soft edges, and then I could go in later and sharpen some, that kind of thing. But the more you do it, the more you'll get used to it as well. And you'll just be like, okay, I know when and how I can do this. Yeah. Hope that makes sense. I'm not going to go as crazy with the darks as it will, or as I did with the light, because we already have a lot of dark there, and by nature of pulling the lights in there, it made everything else kind of seem darker. But you see, even just with the helmet there, I'll turn it off and on. It just rounds it out a little more. You're getting that full shift in color or in value going around instead of it flattening out for a bit. So now remember, this is bent, so maybe the center of it is a little darker. Not too much. I don't want to make it go too extreme. But it's up to you. I think a lot of times, a lot of the advice I've heard and that has actually worked with me or for me is push things further than you would normally be inclined to, and then dial it back. It's easier to dial it back. So, for example, push the values further than you might normally, and then scale it back until it feels right, because you'll be able to tell what feels right at that point. Whereas if you don't push it far enough, you're not really seeing the full range of what you could do and whether or not it can work. So, like for example, I'll pick a color and I'll throw down some red, but I'm like too afraid to make it really saturated, so I'll just make it kind of half saturated, but it's not really doing the justice that it could if you were bolder about it. I use a color example because for me, a lot of my colors were very desaturated. I noticed by the end of my project, everything would still feel really gray when I took it into like the histogram in Photoshop or like the levels, and I looked at it and I was like, huh, why is it so gray? Same with my values. And so ideally you don't want to have to go back and do that post-process stuff. You always can. There's nothing wrong with it. But I found when I push things a little further and I'm bolder about it, especially color and value use, I'm usually happier with the result that comes out afterwards as well. And so I encourage you, whatever you think the color should be or the value should be, go a little further, push it a little more. You might be surprised at the results. And you can always dial it back afterwards, remember. That being said, I do like the process of building up. So like I'll start, like right now, it's really not that crazy value-wise. But I'll go in the next layer, I'll push it a little more, and then my next pass, I'll push it a little more. And so I find really good results with that too, because you could build up until you're at a point that you're happy with it. And so you're just kind of stepping through. You say, okay, I did it this much. Okay, it's not quite there yet. Let me do another pass, do it a little more, and you have a lot of control that way. So there's benefits to each way of working, but just keep yourself on your toes with how you're making your decisions. we'll have to finesse the way this interacts and goes into them. Also, this color is going to have to change because it's matching the body. So I want the top to be brighter than the bottom here. I'll darken that a bit. And you'll see there's a lot that came in from the direct light map here and the ambient occlusion that we might not want to keep, but we can just paint over that later on. Okay. Probably won't do shadows like that, where the rope is crossing over the hand. I'd like to put a shadow there, but since it is mirrored, it means we're going to get weird results over there. So sometimes you got to make a little, some concessions when texturing certain lighting situations based on your UV maps and how you've, optimized the creation of your asset. Some things will be possible and some things won't. And you just got to work around it. That's the trade-off. Now it's going to be up to you while you're texturing to decide how much detail you want in certain areas. Like, for example, right now I'm putting in these bevels. You might not want to have the bevels on both sides. You might just want it to be more flat, and that's your discretion, right? Sometimes it's driven by the style that you're emulating. Other times, if you're just having fun and painting something on your own, well, that's your chance to kind of explore the art and how you want visually the outcome to look. I want things to have like a kind of solid form to them, or at least that's kind of my goal going forward. And so I think adding little chunky bevels along the way, even if I have to repaint this later, this is again like a reminder for myself when I get around to painting that actual edge that, oh, okay, let me go in and sample and paint it flat. So 3D coats, the brush is getting a little wonky around the side. That's probably because I'm using a soft brush still, but that's fine. And then we'll go back to the regular overlay. I'll pop it back up and say, okay, what if we add the highlight over here? I'm going to go back to hard brush. There we go. It's a little steadier looking than the soft was. There we go. And now it feels thicker. It feels like it's a little chunkier. And now I'm only doing it to this side though, because this side's facing up and the chances of the light coming from above is a lot higher, since that's kind of how we're painting it right now. So you gotta keep in mind where the light is coming from. So it would be over here too. And the good news is, the more you texture, if you find yourself not liking certain aspects, you just paint right over those babies. So there we go. So now we have the highlights on the inner side, the inner edges too. And it's really starting to make those read really nicely, because if I turn off both those layers, we're just getting the geometry. And it's still, we're still feeling the form a little, but not nearly as much as when we add the kind of darks and lights that make it a little more readable, a little more obvious. Just going to put in these two for fun, and then we'll move on to the next phase, which will be drawing in the basic details, kind of getting them in place so we can visualize those. Okay, I'm getting a little finicky here, so I'm just gonna back away. Maybe we'll put some on top of here. Yeah, look at that. Just from none to highlight makes those feel a lot bolder. Again, we might split them up later, but for now, no harm in making them feel a little more voluminous. Cool. All right, so we're gonna make sure we save. I'm gonna save another iteration here. Boom. All right, there we go. All right, so let's continue. And now let's go through and put in some basic line work, basic line details to just kind of figure out what's going on with the surfaces here. So I'm gonna make a new layer, call it whatever you want. I'm just gonna call it, we'll just do paint. And I'm essentially gonna go through now and I'm gonna reference my concept and put line work or any kind of detail that we might need as far as blocking things in and things that will be useful to see and have available for when we're starting to paint in the rest of the details. You'll see what I mean in a second. So the first thing we could start off with really is the shield. So I'm going to go over here. I'm going to grab a color, something that's a little darker. Grab my standard brush here. Okay. And a darker color. Just start painting in. Oops. Make sure I'm on the right one here. Paintbrush, there it is. Okay, it's not dark enough. A little darker. And just start getting in the line work. So here I know there was a couple things. One is I wanted this kind of design towards the top. That was kind of like an extra shielded area. And one on the bottom. So we're going to split this and use this as a guide for like the center. Put a line there. Cut it in half again. Something like that. Now, you don't have to be super precise if you don't want to, because, you know, it might give it some character to have a little wonkiness here or there. Go over here. Just kind of mimic what I did with the concept, and we could always change our minds later if we decide that we don't like how it's going. But for now, let's get that information in there. Now, one thing you have available in 3D Coat is something called Steady Stroke up here. Alt-S is the hotkey for that, and you could change the amount right there, and it basically smooths out. You can see it following my mouse. It smooths out your strokes, so if you want like straighter lines in some cases, you could use that, and it'll help out. I don't like having it on all the time because it just kind of feels like it's laggy painting. But when you need straighter lines and marks, definitely comes in handy. So this is essentially going to be the process right now, going through, saying, okay, where did I have details going in? And this way, it's just sketching on top. It just makes it easier for me to remember where I'm painting what. And you could also do this with just flat colors. If I want to go back in, essentially, and grab this color and paint it underneath, and you could use that as a way to dictate where it's going as well. I'll do that sometimes. Now let's go in. We could do the rope. Maybe solo it out, so I don't have to worry about painting on other stuff. There we go. And we will likely add a lot more detail than that, but this, again, gives us the impression of what's there. So now we might as well move on to the sword. Now with the lines there, it kind of feels like, okay, maybe that's wood. And then when we add more to it, it'll be even more obvious. And this should be mirrored on the back. There we go. Just give it a little on the handle too. Maybe the grain goes the other way. I like painting wood grain. It's just kind of fun because it's like squiggly lines, and they have, their shapes and sizes they go in, but it doesn't take much to get it to kind of read well enough. I'm only doing the lines right now. You could add more if you want. There's no rules on this. For instance, if you wanted to go in and grab a lighter color and just kind of pop the shapes out to give it some thickness, that's perfectly fine. And you'll learn as you do more of these, what kind of effects these decisions have early on. And it depends on your layer structure and how you want to keep things organized. A lot of times I will just flatten things down and hope 3D Coat doesn't crash. We'll give that a second. Did we survive? We survived. All right. Save it. Whew. I'll try to fast forward it. Hopefully I fast forwarded through that for you guys. But basically, depending on your layer structure, you could flatten stuff down, or you could keep the overlays, the maps, or you could get rid of them if you don't feel like you're going to have to edit them. And chances are you probably won't, but there's a feeling of security if you do. It's like, oh, okay, if I do change my mind. And then later on, you might be at a point where you're just happy with it, and you're like, okay, you know what, I'm just going to press that button and store it in there permanently. And, there's always a chance you have previous iterations that you can go back to as well on your, if you've saved multiple versions of your file. But in general, you'll feel it out as you're doing the projects, and then you'll kind of get in the habit of how you like to work. I'll make this smaller. Maybe we do, yeah. Subdivide it again. Would have been too thick otherwise. And it is mirrored, so helps to do that. Either that, or we could have it like here, but then, yeah, I'll just keep it right there. We'll try to keep those somewhat even. I did have this plank, the concept kind of cutting through here. So maybe we move those over a little. See how that feels. We could always change where that cut is as well in our model. So the model's not sacred. We can change the model, and chances are, like I said, I want to be updating the UVs on those two to be separate from the side ones, the little pegs, so we get different lighting on those. And then I probably want to add back in these guys. I thought I'd be happy just texturing them in, but I kind of want to see the model pop out. So let's see, is this too thin? This might be too thin. How does that feel? That's not too bad. Get rid of these. I mean, I like the simplicity of that. One more. Maybe we do just follow the concept here. We could just go with that. See how that feels. And now you don't have to be as clean as I've been with the lines. I'm starting to realize that myself, is that, oh yeah, I can kind of be a little more freeformed with this, and it might give your texturing a little more energy and a little more life. So that actually reminds me of how I used to paint and textures. I would just be way too anal about the lines being like clean, and it didn't really help the result, to be honest, unless you're specifically going for like a really clean style. It might be nice just to kind of throw the paint on there, not too haphazardly, but enough that at least you're getting a result and it's legible. That's the important thing, is that, is it going to look like what you're trying to achieve? But in this case, I'm just being like, maybe not be so precious with my line that, oh, okay, there's a blurry spot, and now I have to erase and try again. It's like, that's not the important part here, right? The important part here is giving us basically guidelines to paint on top of. So we know when we're putting our values down where it's going to go. Because even with these, we could kind of give it a little more volume just by going a little lighter on our brush, right? So we'll get to that. I do kind of want these cracks to be where the wood is, but might get rid of them and then manually put in ones that are asymmetrical. Because here we went with asymmetry, but an option is too that we could leave it blank like the bottom and then cut in detail later. That way we already know where the detail is because we painted it, and we could add geometry that supports where that detail is painted. If that doesn't make sense, we'll get to it and you'll see what I mean. Okay. Now the helmet, you do maybe just to visualize this a little. That's enough to give it the impression we're going for. And then same here with the grass. Gonna keep the grass pretty stylized, I think. Might be able to stack a couple of these on top of each other. We'll see. This is not the focus. It's just a kind of a grounding element. Something to tie our guy to the ground here. The rocks we probably don't need to touch in this case. Now, let's get his post. All right. Then his arms, I believe, were also going to be wood. The color will have to be corrected, but I did want them to be wood as well. If I remember correctly. Now these are mirrored, are they not? Yes, they are. Now a lot of these are kind of bold looking right now, but I'll probably pare them down a bit once we actually start painting them. And of course, get some reference to help visualize the shapes a little more. Because yeah, right there, it's pretty strong. We probably won't have it be that strong. I actually might tone it down a little just right now anyway. Because we still see where they are. We still know where we have to make the strokes. And that's the important part. Cool. All right, that helps differentiate it. Even though the colors is the same, it helps differentiate it from the shirt underneath the chest, that kind of like color that was so similar to the face and the chest. The wood just kind of stands out a little more, just texture alone. So, speaking of that part though, let's go ahead and hide the shield. And we'll start drawing in here too. Say, okay, I know I want this guy to kind of be torn open on the sides. Not like torn open, but let's see here, get rid of the belt. But have it's sewn together, so you know maybe it's stuffed with something. And then we can have it kind of sewn shut. So you can do those with different colors too. For now, I just want to get the idea in there. Now it should be mirrored. There we go. Kind of faking some fold lines from the belt here. So we'll probably want to cut some pieces off here, serrate the bottom. I think we were going to do an alpha. So you could also use this opportunity to say, okay, maybe I want an alpha cut right there. And so you could, a lot of times I will have a separate layer that I just use flat black, and then you could actually go ahead and use that layer as the alpha channel itself. But for now, let's just get those areas marked off. And then we could decide change them or not, and then paint the alpha in. Those are a little too even looking. There we go. It's a little better. Maybe move this one over slightly. All right. So with this, I'm actually starting to question maybe it's too far back if we're not really seeing it from the front view, but it's not that big of a deal because 3/4 view is probably where we're going to take a lot of pictures from or doing a turnaround. So it's a little more towards the back, which kind of I think makes sense. If we did want to move them though, let's say we wanted to move it. So I just want to show you guys this anyway. So save it. But let's say we wanted that a little more forward. What can we do? Well, there's this tool over here called the Transform Copy tool. If you select that and then drag out of shape, it's kind of finicky to control, so you gotta be careful. If we drag out of shape, it's gonna copy that. And now you can move this around by clicking and dragging within it. You can see kind of the ghost of that image. And now you could move it and position it wherever you want. I think you could rotate as well. Yep. And then if you press enter, it goes ahead and pops it down. You're probably getting a lot of ideas from this right away, which is good. You could, draw one screw and then copy paste it everywhere, or like a gash, or or stitches like this. Anything that's repeatable, an eyeball, and populate it really quickly around your mesh. And one thing I discovered accidentally recently is that it can work by copying and pasting from outside of the program. So, for example, I had something copied on my clipboard from my reference, and I accidentally hit Control V, thinking I was in another program, and it put it into 3D Coat as one of these copied portions, as these green things. And so I could have just pressed Enter and pasted it onto whatever I was working on. So I thought that was pretty neat. But what we're going to do here with this one, if we wanted to change it, there's an option here called Erase Old Position. And so this does what it sounds like. It'll get rid of the one that was there. So you're essentially cutting it instead of copying it. And then you could paste it down wherever you want. Or you could just use it to delete stuff if you don't paste it back down. And then the other settings are worth a look. If we hit Erase Old Position, grab this. Also, like Photoshop, if you hit spacebar, you can move around your marquee selection. I believe that works in Photoshop, maybe Max or Maya as well, but I know Photoshop for sure. Let go. Now we have it, and I could just say, I want it here instead. Press enter, there we go, and now we could decide, do I like it moved forward more, or do I like it towards the back more? So it's that simple. I kind of like it towards the back more, I think. I'm going to leave it there for now, and we could always while we're painting, kind of nudge it forward if we want, or we can do this technique again. But that is, I feel, a really useful tool. So we can get these things back, save our game here, and let's sketch in the face. So this is also not symmetried, which means we could get a little fun with it if we want. I kind of like the dumbfounded expression from the concept, so I'll probably keep something similar. This will be like sewn in. We'll add some like beard, like whiskers from the material that'll be underneath. We could probably add some of that too on another mesh, a little kind of like flayed out strands of hay or whatnot. And remember, holding control will erase with the same brush, so you don't have to switch to your eraser. Now, we'll probably put these in as stitching as well, or some kind of crease or cut, or paint. So I haven't thought that fully through yet, to be honest, but that's okay. There we go. Now, if you want, you can add any other detail you might find useful. For example, if I want to put in like, okay, there might be a shadow here, I can kind of hint at it. We have that thing on his chest, like the symbol. I'm going to do this on another layer. Thank goodness I made it symmetrical to begin with. And then for up here, we want to just start simulating the wood here too. Just so that we know if it's wood. You know, outside of the color, just hinting a little bit at the surface texture can go a long way. Gets a little funky when you have to mirror it, but gotta make it work. There we go. Now the helm feels a little more like wood as well. So I think that's all we need, minus one thing. We're going to fill in that color on the shield. And then we can continue with the next step after this. So let's get that color filled in. I'm going to go ahead, make a new layer, and call it shield metal. Oopsies. And then we could go in and select that same color. My layer's back on. Switch to, I'll go with a flat brush, and then just paint that color in there. That does not look like the right color. There we go. Cool. Now, it's not imperative that it was the exact same color, but since we had it easily available, figured why not. All right, I was just taking a look. All right, so we'll want to add the bolts, change those UVs, and that's stuff that's going to happen later. So I'm going to take notes to basically remind myself, and chances are I'll remember just by looking at it, to be honest, as we go along. But sometimes you forget this kind of stuff. You're like, oh yeah, I want to do that. So there's no harm in just writing it down. There we go. Make sure you save. And then again, I'm going to iterate. Now we're at 05. Cool. There we go. Now this is typically where I start having the most fun. So at this point, we have just about everything blocked in. You know, there's a couple changes we wanted to make to the model later down the line, very minimal things with the bolts on the headband and the shield. But here's the point where we're just going to kind of go in, isolate one object or area at a time, and then just render it out. And this will give us a little more surface detail. This will give us a little more interest to work with, and it's general just taking it up another level. So before I get started with that, I'm looking at the grass. I just want to make a new layer. I'm going to call it alpha. And I'm just going to paint black around the border of the grass that we could use later on as an alpha mask when we eventually bring it into Marmoset to take a look at it and present it. So I'm going to go ahead, use hard brush. Just going to solo the grass by holding Alt and clicking. And I'm just going to trace it, essentially. And this will just help us visualize it a little more, instead of seeing the whole block as green. Now the good thing about this too is that we could edit this later if we decide that we don't like the shape of it or we want to touch it up a little. So nothing here is really set in stone. And remember, holding control and painting is going to act like an eraser. So it's a nice easy way instead of having to go back to your eraser tool each time. So we'll unsolo that, same thing. Alt click it. And now it's just easier to visualize just the green as it is. And then we could paint under it and not have to worry about it going outside those lines. Like so. So if I wanted to flatten them back out and then start painting on top of it like that, we absolutely could. But I digress. Let's get back into the main guy. Just figured we were already looking at this, so my mind's like, paint it up. And I could go back, for example, to the alpha and say, okay, I want a little more space over there. Boom. So back to our paint layer. You could create another one on top of this, but all we have right now is the lines on here, and I'm okay with painting over those. So feel free to be as liberal with your layers as you want. You could always collapse them or delete them or whatnot. It's kind of just saving yourself some trouble. All right, so I think I'm going to start here with the shield. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to isolate the shield like we did with the grass. And I'm just going to go ahead and start painting on it. I'm thinking about the form like we did earlier. So most of it is actually already blocked out. There's some cases where maybe I want to add a little more like this underside, where it's not as dark as down there. So we turn the form a little. And if we want down there to be even darker, we can just sample a darker color and paint it right in. So we're looking at the form and we're reinforcing that continuously. And then we are also going to be thinking about the surface details themselves. So in this case, if it's metal, think about what you normally see on metal, scratches, scrapes, surface undulations, maybe for example, it'll like push in a little and come out a little because of, the surface is slightly disrupted. So it's going to have highlights and shadows in very subtle ways, but that will give us a indication of what the surface is like. So we could just start putting in really softly some darker and lighter colors, just spatter them around and get a feel for what it looks like and how you might want that surface to feel. So it's a training dummy, so it's probably a little worn, at least. It depends, how new the shield is or whatever the story is that you're thinking. I'm thinking this guy was not heavily used, maybe had a couple battles in him. So there might be some marks and beat marks and maybe some scratches, right? We could put in maybe a sword slash came down from someone. So we can add in a little cut. just play with ideas in your head and build up a little story. And it'll give you ideas on how you want to add your details. So I'm going to go through now and just paint and see what we come out with this. Adding like a little bottom lip to this, give it a little depth. I'm also keeping in mind, this is very important, it's going to depend on how your asset is going to be seen ultimately, but keep in mind where your light source is. Especially for hand painted stuff, you're going to have a light source that's going to dominate your model. And you're going to have, in some cases, you're going to bring it in to an engine like Unreal or Marmoset or Unity, and you're going to light it in the game as well if it's not going to be completely unlit. And so sometimes you might have to light it a little more generically, but for a portfolio piece or something that you're kind of doing as like a 3D illustration, you definitely want to keep in like an overall, where is my main light coming from, and then decide, as we'll get to later on, if you have significant bounce light either from the sky or perhaps the grass is bouncing up, depending on the environment that your creature or item or environment is going to be in, and you want to be keeping all that in mind as you go forward. But for right now, we're kind of not getting too deep into that. We're just getting into, like in this case, I'm painting this a little lighter because we have that light kind of top down, and then this is also rotated a direction, so the light from above is kind of going to be able to hit that. I hope that makes sense. So we're lighting it, keeping in mind that our light source is above, scene-wise above. And sometimes it'll be really obvious if your scene looks weird, your objects look weird. It might be because they're lit inconsistently. And there's going to be some that slip by and some things that maybe aren't as noticeable that you'll miss them or other people will miss them. But the big ones will likely stand out. And then you get to decide if it's something that you want to do intentionally for a reason, or if you want to go ahead and fix it. But it's not always obvious. At least for me. I know it's constant vigilance about looking and, okay, where's this facing? Where's this facing? That kind of stuff. I also like to build up contrast over time. I feel like as if I should be bolder sometimes, but there's a higher level of control, at least for me, with building up a little and then a little more, and then finding a spot that you're happy with, rather than going like full bright right away. You know, there's some value to that if you are able to control that, but for now, I feel like contrast might be too high at this moment. But we could build up to something like that. And a lot of this is also style dependent. So I don't want you to feel like you're doing it wrong if you're putting in a lot more contrast than I am right from the beginning. Experiment with it, you know? It's all learning. But the benefit of being able to throw in some darker lights that are wildly, I guess, more aggressive than what you already have in there is that it could give you an idea of where you might want to take it, or like you're essentially establishing, okay, these will be what my highlights will be like value wise, or this will be like what my shadows are. And so putting those in there could establish the rest of the scene for you. What I'm getting at is there's a lot of options, and there's no inherently wrong way to do it as long as you're keeping track of the values you're putting down and you're making them consistent across your object. All right, let's keep painting. You notice we have a plane change here with the angle, so we want to make sure the values are different as well. This one being slightly brighter because it is facing up more. For now, I'll put in like little hints of damage, and then I like to generally later on do like a damage pass with my detail on a separate layer, but I feel like it's nice to get some of the detail in there early, just to remind yourself that, hey, it's not going to be completely clean, or just to make it visually a little more interesting to look at. That's getting a shadow from the AO that we did and the lighting maps that we did earlier. So that's okay. I'm going to leave that there because it's going to wind up there anyway. But I might try making this darker where that changes, just to push that form change a little more. Now we have the outside a little painted up. Let's do the inside because it's looking a little unbalanced between the out and the inside, huh? I'm going to solo it again after I save. Make sure we don't lose it. Shield back up. And then I'm also going to paint in where it meets because I think not quite dark enough there. We're losing the connection point. I like to turn on the wireframe to be able to see the mesh while I'm painting. Sometimes it can be a little useful, that's for sure. The hotkey for that, I believe, is just 4. Number 4. Or actually, it might be W. I might have rebound mine. So it's either W or 4, but you could check over here in View, Wireframe. So it says W. I also have mine bound to 4. Just gonna put a couple more scratches and stuff. I'm also trying to think where, right, so if people are gonna fight this, where might the damage be? And in this case, they're probably gonna be swiping it from the top. You know, maybe they'll try stabbing it in different ways sometimes, but for the most part, they're probably attacking from the top. So there's gonna be slashes coming downwards. So stuff like that will help you to create more believable kind of damage and wear and tear. So we're putting a decent amount in here now. It's kind of fun. That being said, I do usually keep it on a separate layer, but if you have a good reason to, like if you're not sure if you want to keep it on there or you for a work reason, it could help, but it's not absolutely necessary. Plus, you could always extract it and then paint over the base too if you absolutely need it separate. Here, I'm just kind of, as I'm going along, I'm deciding, okay, it'd be nice to see a little more wear in some areas, hence popping it in there. Okay. I know I mentioned the wood, so let's do that now. I like to start the wood by doing a little or big strokes to establish like planks. Right, you're getting like the sides of those. And by doing this, you're kind of setting the thickness. If you want it to be really flat, you can just keep them kind of closer to one another. After that, we'll do like you saw on the rest of the model where I'm kind of putting in some grain. I like blocking this stuff in because then it gives us an idea of where to put our highlights and stuff. I'll do the opposite value for the dark. just so we can see it. There we go. It already stands out a bit. So I'm going to pick a darker color. It's already pretty dark, so we're mostly going to be building up, but I just want to push in some of these areas first. Saturate it a little, and then just hit up the crevices. Now I don't want to outline it everywhere. Just kind of want to get it where things are meeting, like at the edge here, or if I really want to just make it stand out a little more in some places. And then I'll push some stuff in more along where we did the grain. So we put that grain down, and then we have nice landmarks that we could use to build upon. You want to make sure you vary the thickness as well as the opacity. You don't want it to be an even, unless it's your style. You don't want it to be like an even line like that. It won't be as interesting feeling, I don't think. Especially for something natural. For something mechanical, it makes a little more sense. For something natural, variety. Alright, so we got some darks in there. Now we're going to come through and we're going to lighten up the edging. And that should give us the definition we need for now. So I'm just using all the colors we already have here too. Like this is a lot brighter inside, so I'm just going to use that for our edges over here. And we'll get in later to adding more variety in our hue, but for now, keeping it kind of unified by using the same colors is really helpful. All right, let's get one that's a little brighter. This is all very dark right now. Okay, that kind of does the job for now. Kind of overkill for this stage, but sometimes you just zone out. And we can come back and touch this up more once we start getting the rest of it a little further. But for now, that should do it. Assuming I pull myself away. I'm pulling myself away. Come on. Yeah. Yeah. Alright. say all right, and then my body keeps going. Now stop it. Stop it. What are you doing? Why are you still painting? You're just making it worse. Okay. Should probably not say okay until I'm actually ready, huh? So we're going to force ourselves to back up. I'm going to go over it with single value, kind of softer, just to flatten the values out a little, because I think I want a little more contrasty than I wanted to. I'm also going to add a little saturation to it. I'm just going to brush right over it. See, so I took some of the contrast out and also gave it a little more life with the saturation. So undo it, saturate it a little differently, a little less red, and then I'm just going to brush that right in the center. A little too hard. There we go. I'll do that if I feel like I have too much saturation or the colors are all not where I exactly want them yet. Because then after this, we could always go back in, grab a dark color, and then we build up our darks again. So it's a useful way to say, okay, those darks or lights weren't exactly where I wanted them yet. I'm going to go ahead, lighten the whole thing. You're still keeping all your shapes there, so it's like a guide for you. And then you go in and you give it another shot. You could pull shapes out even easier. So I do that quite a lot. It's pretty helpful. Unhide the rest of it. I'm just gonna give this a little boost on the edge. See what highlights can do. I'm just checking if I want to add these in there. They're a little strong right now. Knock that down a peg. Okay. So now that we have that in there, that kind of gives us a benchmark for what we're shooting for. And I could probably put a little more detail and scratches in certain areas if I want. Like, don't really like how this one's feeling right now. Let me just touch that up a tad. Maybe make it a little smaller overall. Throw some of that wood color in the shadow side. There we go. Something like that. We'll get into that a little later too, using surrounding colors as a way to add interest. But there we go. So I think that kind of sets the direction for how we want to paint this. And from now, the point is, or our goal is from here, going back in and kind of applying this level of paint to the rest of it, and then deciding, do we want to add more detail? Do we want to subtract some detail? Do another lighting pass on top of that, using some overlay or soft light or all that jazz. But for now, I think we have a good idea and goal on what we can do to the rest of it. And the good news is we can use our eyedropper on, for instance, the wood and the metal and the stuff we did already. And there's a lot of presence of those around, and use those same colors elsewhere. That way it feels a little more unified. But for now, we want to take this and we're going to apply it around. So I'm going to save and we'll continue. From here, I think I'm going to continue with the metal and wood first, and then kind of bop around the rest of the materials and bring them up to a similar level of rendering. So right now we're working on the paint layer. I'm going to make a new one, and I'm just going to call it something like Paint 2, and I'll probably collapse it down later, but I like to be able to kind of toggle it on and off and see the changes, just in case I make some changes that I'm not so happy with. I could roll them back there, but then otherwise collapse down what I like. You can keep it all separate too. It's just kind of a preference thing, but it has some uses. So let's see. I'm just going to go ahead and start color picking from the shield here onto the other pieces of metal, the wood onto the other wood, and then we'll just kind of go from there. Right now I'm essentially focusing on just bringing up the lightness a little, doing some highlights on the edges, and then bringing the shape forward a little in certain spots. I might update this model later to have a slight bend to it. We'll see. I like the idea of it having sheen going across the front and middle. Now in this case, I'm color picking from the belt in order to do this little under bevel here, because one, I know it's going to be a darker color because it's going to be facing away from our light source, but two, I can use that color and it's going to simulate the belt kind of bouncing, the bounce light from the belt onto the buckle. So we get a little bonus there. It's subtle, yes, but it's nice to have a little variation there. It's kind of low resolution, the texture, because this belt is not taking up a lot of space on the texture, but do what you can. Plus, we're going to be pretty zoomed out from there, so shouldn't make too much of a difference. Just a little blurry when we zoom in. Kind of stands out when you zoom out. Not too bad in some distances. We could see, maybe we'll take it out, but for now, let's just leave it in there. Now, metal is going to have more contrast than something like cloth or wood. So the differences between the highlights and the darker reflective colors are going to be, it's going to be a much wider range of values. Now we're going to be doing another pass to correct a lot of the values. So as long as it looks pretty good while you're painting within itself, we could always correct it later by adjusting it more on a full texture level where we compare it to everything else in the texture. But for now, if it looks pretty good within itself, then we can adjust it later with the levels or curves and bring it where it needs to be. Try not to fixate on stuff like that yet. And there we go. That's what I mean by being able to toggle it so we have the A and B of it before and after. So that's a pretty nice upgrade. We didn't do too much to it, but it stands out, feels a little more metallic. And then we can move on. Maybe we'll do the rest of the belt real quick. So let's save it. And then I'll hide everything but the belt and the buckle. Then we're just going to go through and hit the belt up with a quick pass. Now it is symmetried, which should help save us some time. So I'm going to go and I'm going to do the edges first, and then I'm going to give the actual belt a little dimension. But you get a lot done just by doing some edge work. You don't want to completely just highlight it. You want to have some range in the values you're putting down. Don't just full color highlight it if you can avoid it. You know, unless that's what it calls for, but tend to avoid that and be a little more selective with it. Trying to rough up the edges a little too, so they're not completely clean. We'll do another pass for like detailing and damage later, but if it hits your fancy, you can go in and kind of hint at that stuff or pop it in as much as you're comfortable while you're doing this kind of thing. And I'm going to go in and I'm going to kind of, actually I might do it with part of our next pass. I'm basically going to go in and give it a little volume like this, where I darken the top to make it look like it's sunken in a little, and then brighten the bottom, like that's catching more light. So something like that. I want to preserve the detail that we have on the surface, so I'm probably going to do that part of our next pass. After we do the basics, we'll go in and then we'll reinforce those shapes a little more. And that's something that's kind of more all-encompassing of the form. It's bigger shapes than these are. And I could have done that first, but sometimes it's easier to put in just like surface level details. A lot of it's preference, but it can be easier just to do little details like this first and then go over with like an overlay, for example, and then push those shapes around. Okay, and from here we got the belt. Now let's go ahead. Put a little of that color right on the end here, a little of the belt color on the end, and just softly in the shadows here to tie it together a little more. Because it is a darker color, so I might as well tint it a little closer to the surrounding objects so it looks like they're interacting with each other a little more. Just a good way to make your colors feel a little more harmonious. Right now, I think we'll do shoulder pads. The metal on the shoulder pads, we'll do the insides afterwards. I'm going to hide everything but the shoulder pads and the shield. That way I could use my color picker here, my eyedropper, and grab the same colors. That way they're pretty consistent with themselves. So I'm going to do kind of the same thing that we did on the buckle. Actually, we can unhide that too, just to have as reference. So I'm going to do that same thing where I'm adding a little more contrast. Not a lot right now, but a little more that it should read more as that material. Maybe we'll give it a little beat up damage. Again, like the shield. And try to keep it pretty light. But I mean, who knows how much this guy's been beaten up. I'm lightening this up right here slightly to kind of imply that the metal's bouncing off of it a little. The light is bouncing off the metal just a little. So this is not something that's necessary, but I kind of saw it and I was like, what about? But otherwise, yeah, it's not one of those things you have to worry about remembering. right now for these, I'm mostly thinking about the value. I'm just trying to put like little soft gradients everywhere just to push the form to make it read a little better. But we'll likely go over this with another color. As we see what's around it, we'll unhide everything and see, okay, what might be affecting this, that kind of thing. Might as well add the wood while we're back here. Seem to have forgotten that. And you notice I hopped over to this handle. A lot of times that'll happen if I notice something that needs attention pretty briefly, or I'm just right next to it. I'll just jump over and fix the stuff I see right away. That way I don't have to write a note for later. I'm just like, oh, okay, let's just deal with that while we're here. Trying to decide if I like it more at the end there with the gradient, or if I want it to be towards the top more. I'll have to push it a little more. It's mirrored, so it's going to have it on the bottom as well, though. But I think it could work. And then this a little, and then we'll go and really push the color, the highlight in here. We'll see how I feel. Might roll it back. I don't hate it, but I don't feel like it's necessarily an improvement from the other one, but we'll see when the rest of it's in there, how it lines up with the rest of the lighting. It might just simply be that I move this highlight a little closer to the center. We keep it off center, but maybe a little closer. All right, we'll come back in here and polish this up a little more later. I think it does the job for now. Don't want to get too lost in it. Chances are we'll come back, polish it, have some time in Photoshop, which I like to do a lot of my detail work. I just find it to be easier to do details there versus here in 3D Coat. For as much as I love 3D Coat, Photoshop's tools and precision are really nice. So, they both have their strengths. And leave it like that for now. Definitely an improvement. Okay. The belt, shoulders, back of the shield. Yeah, we'll probably undo that change right there. Might as well just do it right now, to be honest. We tried it though. We gave it a shot, and that's what's important. If you have a feeling about something and you're not sure, better to try it and find out than be sitting there wondering. There we go. Much better.